Hello and welcome back. Once again, I have driven up on you without any warning and come with the live Q&A. So as always, what I'm going to do, since I know few people are actually online right now, I'm going to go ahead and just start talking about what it is that I want to talk about, and then as people come on, I'll answer questions. So I want to talk to you about this idea of being God on earth. Let's see if I can adjust the camera here a little more. All right. So this idea of being God on earth. Now, what I'd like for you to do is, before we get into it, I want for you to take a look at this picture that I used for the opener. And I just want you to look at it and see, you know, what feelings come to mind. What does it mean to you to be God on earth? Just let your mind flow and just react to it. I'm probably going to address some of these things and compare them to what it really means. So there's a reason I picked this picture. Anyway, take a look at it. Okay, so as you stared at that picture and you imagined yourself being God on earth according to that picture, what comes to mind? What does that mean to be God? So we are going to take a look at that, and we're going to compare it to what I believe the original understanding of what that meant to be a God on earth. You know, I used the words very specifically. I said becoming God with a capital G on earth, because that is really how we view divinity. So whenever, you know, I'm finding that the more I talk about this, that I'm appreciating the feedback I'm getting from people and questions and interactions, because then it helps me understand how I can better clarify my communications so that people know what it is that I mean when I'm speaking, and helps me understand, you know, what it is. Because sometimes I just have a concept and I just make the assumption that you know what I'm talking about, and of course you don't. You don't have my experience, you have your experience. And so you're going to have your own assumptions attached to certain words and phrases and ideas. So it's important for me that I be able to express what it is I really want to say. So again, think about what is it that comes to mind when I say becoming God on earth, and what does God do? And you know, in that picture we see this giant, you know, monotheist type God, which, by the way, that view of God actually comes from Odin, because the original Abrahamic understanding of Jehovah is that Jehovah does not have a countenance. But so the idea of a big bearded man in heaven, that is actually Odin. That comes from the idea of Odin, and that was transferred into Western Christianity. So it didn't come from the original Abrahamic tradition. That idea is unique to the European tradition. So anyway, that's just a side note. So again, when you think of God, do you think, and what do you think of when I use the word omnipotent? If I were to say that you are omnipotent God in your life, what does that mean to you? This came about from just a recent conversation with somebody on commenting on my channel, and talking about this subject, about being God on earth, and the idea of having too much responsibility and how difficult it is to control everything. And within that, I don't know that this person was thinking that, but within that, I started thinking about that and how different that was from what I was trying to communicate with the idea of becoming God on earth. The idea that we not only have control over reality, but we have control over other people. And so this comes back to this thing about creating your perfect life. People want to know how to control other people, how to get other people to do what they want. The idea of What is my responsibility in the world? What am I supposed to be doing here? So I've been sharing a lot about the ideas that are found in this book here, which I'm going to show you. You probably won't be able to read it because it's going to be kind of blurry, but the title of the book is The Shamanic Secret Commandment to a Perfect Life, and then the subtitle is The Missing Ingredient to the Secret. So a lot of the stuff we're talking about, even though we're not talking about it directly in the book, this book lays the foundation for the proper assumption that you have to start with to know what it means to become a god on earth. So here's the book. If you don't have it, I recommend getting it. And in that book, I talk a lot about what I call the soul desire. Okay, so I do see there are some people online. 3 or 4 people here. Good. Okay. All right, so we'll wait a little bit longer for some more people to show up. Let's see, how long have I been on? 7 minutes? What the heck just happened here? Okay, let's see. I'm offline. Really? No, okay, I'm online. Sorry, I messed with my... Sorry about that. I hope I'm still good. Me and technology sometimes fight with each other. All right, so back to this idea of being God on earth, being omnipotent and creating your own reality. The idea of creating your perfect life. And I've been talking a lot about this idea of what it means and what it is that we're doing here, incarnated in physical flesh, and the dichotomy of being in this finite existence and yet still being omnipotent. And then what does that have to do with, how do we interface with other people? So then we come to the question of, well, if we're all infinite gods, who's controlling everything, right? So this is, again, a very black and white kind of understanding. Again, it comes from the dualism that we received with the monotheist religions, the Abrahamic religions. And again, I want to stress that that is a very relatively new understanding about our nature as human beings. Relatively new in terms of the history of the human race. If we are, depending on who you talk to, we're at least 100,000 years old. But if you want to go back even further to, there have been other species of human beings like Neanderthals and Denisovans. If you want to go back even further, then we're going a lot further back. We might even go back 500,000 years or more. So if we've been around that long, we have had a much different understanding about who we are and about our nature to our relationship to ourselves and our relationship to the universe. In fact, as I'm thinking about it, I was flipping around YouTube and I found some really interesting information that I had looked at before, but I looked at it again with some new eyes about some uncontacted civilizations that we have. And there are a few. The few that have not been contacted, I think there's some still left in the Amazon, a few. And there's some in New Guinea. In fact, there's a large... New Guinea is huge. It's almost a continent. It's not really an island. It's a continent. And there are still uncontacted tribes that have been there since the first migration of human beings. And there are some in the Indian Ocean. I think it's the Andaman Islands. And there's one tribe still left on a fairly small island, and they have this. They are so fiercely independent. They're completely Stone Age. I mean, everything is like it would have been 20,000 years ago. And interesting note about these people that I've really enjoyed is that when the tsunami that hit in the Indian Ocean, and you have these these tourists, these Western tourists are down in Thailand or wherever, and they see the tide going out, right? Because there's a tidal wave that's coming, and if you know anything about tidal waves, it's not like a normal wave. It's the whole part of the ocean starts to get sucked up, right? And so it creates this wave. You don't see it if you're out on a boat. You might see a little bit of a wave, but it's actually the entire ocean coming towards the land. And so what happens is, as that starts coming in, then the tide, this is why I call it a tidal wave, the tide pulls out, and so it can go out for who knows how long, really far. So you have all these, these Western European tourists or in Thailand or wherever it is, and they see the tide go out, and like a bunch of idiots, they start walking out to see what's happening. Where is that tide going? They start walking out following it. And of course, then you see this huge wall of water come, and they can't get away from it. So these primitive tribes, very smart, they see the tide go out, and they go, if the water's going out, it has to come back. So, right? Makes sense, right? So they climb up to the top of, to higher ground or the top of the mountains, and they watch the wave come in, and then they go back down. Whereas all the, the modern tourists, get wiped away and destroyed because they're not smart enough to make the conclusion that, wait a minute, if the tide's going out, it's going to come back, right? Anyway, that's just a little side note. But what I was really enjoying about thinking about that is that there's that one little island that to this day there has not been a successful communication with them. And I think, from what I understand, the only attempted communication was by the British Empire, probably in 17 whatever, and they tried to communicate with them, and they had this whole thing set up where they would kidnap people, and then they would treat them like kings. They would give them food and all this stuff, and then send them back and say, go tell the rest of your tribe how cool we are and we're great people. And then what would happen is they'd go, let these people in, and then the British army would come in and they'd take over the whole place. And that's how they would conquer without, going into battle. So they did that with these people. I can't remember the name of the island on there. And they grabbed a couple of kids and a couple of elderly people and took them off. And, they hadn't been contacted by anybody, probably since the first migration of human beings, 30, 50,000 years ago. And so they had no immunity to modern European diseases, and so the old people died almost instantly. And they realized this isn't going to work, and so they brought the two kids back and let them go, and then decided to just leave that little island alone. It wasn't that big of a deal. And so those islanders must have gotten the idea that, don't let any of these strangers come onto your island. So whenever, even up to this day, if a helicopter flies over or if a boat comes into their waters, they all come out with their bows and arrows, and they just start firing away, firing bows and arrows at you. And in the 70s, the last attempted contact was in the 70s, and it was a group of East Indians who came, and they were wanting, apparently, from what I understand, they were just wanting to make contact with these people, and they brought with them gifts. So they brought with them a pig, and they brought with them cooking pots and all of that, and they put it on the beach, and then got back in their boat and watched. And of course the tribe comes out, and they start firing arrows at them, get the hell away from us. And they did something which I thought was really smart, which was they went to, and grabbed the pig, slaughtered it and buried it, and then took all the gifts and buried the gifts. So the message was very clear: we are not taking your gifts. But from what the way I look at it, and I'm projecting my understanding, I don't know what they're thinking. I'd like to think that I might have some understanding about it, but who knows. But the feeling that I got when I thought about what must that be like for them is that they're still in that original shamanic understanding of the universe that we all had, because they're us. That's what we all looked like. You look at those people on those islands, that's how we all looked. 50,000 years ago, we all looked that way. You can look them up and find out what they look like. And from their perspective, we know from the other tribes that still live on the other Andaman Islands, we know that they have a very typical animist understanding of the universe, which is that there are multiple universes intersecting with our own. And for them, one of the main important ways of determining how to make choices is what happens when they are in the dream state. And when they dream, they come out of the dream and then they know how to make choices. Now, from what I'm teaching, the Thunder Path, what that's telling me is that they have a clean, unconscious mind. Their lower self is clean. And so the higher self is able to communicate with the lower self, the subconscious and the unconscious, which is where all of our dreams come from. And so they're able to take that as reality, and dreams are just as real as waking life. So again, I'm taking that same idea and I'm putting it on this last of those Andaman tribes that haven't been contacted. And why is it that they are trying to fiercely defend their little island from anybody? In fact, any other tribes, they won't let anybody onto their little island. And I think it's because I'm projecting my imagination of what I think it might be for me, but I think they understand that they have their own world. They have the world, the reality. And that even though we see ourselves as humans just like them, they would be right in saying these are evil entities that are trying to come into our existence. We have to fight them off. And they do something really smart, you know, when they're given these gifts, they don't take them. You know, when I think again about the colonization of the Americas by Europeans, what we aren't taught a lot about is that there was a huge conquest that happened before Europeans ever set foot onto the Americas. And that was disease. And from the perspective of the Native Americans, when people started dying of, you know, polio and all kinds of poxes and all kinds of diseases they didn't have immunity towards, they saw it as a spiritual attack. They saw it as negative entities attacking and killing the tribe. So if you look at it from that perspective, that can be a very interesting and accurate understanding of what happened, because that's the best way to have warfare. And so I look at it from this perspective, is that we have all this unconscious garbage in our modern society. Unconscious meaning we're not aware of it. And so we were fighting them on an unconscious plane of existence before we set foot on there. And I think these people, these Andaman people who haven't been contacted, they're hip to that. They are clear that by letting these other people onto their land, it's not just about people walking onto their island. It's about these entities from another world, another dimension, coming in and invading their world, their dimension. And, you know, maybe they see themselves as the last humans on Earth. They would be right. They would be among the very last original human civilization that held to the understanding that our ancestors had 100,000 years ago. So anyway, I kind of got off on a little tangent there, but so this is a Q&A, and I do have some things here that I want to get to, but I am willing to, of course, take some questions. So feel free to ask questions whenever you like. And bear in mind that if I think your question is something that I have an answer to, I'll respond to it. If I don't respond to your question, it's either I don't have the answer to it or it's not pertinent or something like that. So let's take a look here. All right, strength, honor, we're not all black. This is a myth. So I'm not even going to get into that. I don't agree with you. I'm not interested in getting into a pissing contest with you about that. I don't agree with you, and science doesn't agree with that. If you want to hold on to that, you can. This might not be the right channel for you. If you hold on to that, if you're not willing to see it from another perspective, I'm probably going to say things that you're not going to like hearing. And you're free to have your own opinion, but I'm not going to get into that racial thing with you about that. So, Saeed asks, what do you think of Odin was first a god on Earth? That's a really interesting understanding, you know, and I find myself a lot of times talking about Odin in that very same way, that he was first human being who became God. I also, you know, I teach that Odin represents the human being achieving his or her complete awakening to their true self. And as I've said before, there's a difference between Odin and the rest of the gods. And as we know from the historical record, I've talked about this, that Odin was not the first Indo-European king of the gods. In fact, we know from the other Indo-European religions and the similarities, especially, you know, for me, the Vedic is a good example, that the first king of the gods was who we would call Tiw. The root of Tiw, T, D, is the same root for all of the heads of the pantheons and all of the other Indo-European traditions except the Germanic. Zeus, his real name is D. Tiw in the Germanic tradition. Deus Pita in the Vedic tradition. Jupiter, Deus Piter. They all mean sky father. And so that was the first of the king of the gods. And then we see in the Germanic tradition, we see Odin. And Tiw is not the king of the gods. So this seems to indicate that there was a recent change in their understanding, and that Odin became the king of the gods in their tradition. And so that you have to ask the question, why? If he wasn't the original king of the gods, how did he become the All-Father, the king of the gods? My belief is that we look deeper in the myths and we see that Odin, in the Voluspa, depending on the translation that you read, it starts talking about dwarves. And it says that the celestial gods fashioned dwarves. They didn't create dwarves, they fashioned dwarves in humanoid form from Brimer's blood, which means the ambient energy of the universe. Because Brimer, the giant Ymir, which is similar to the god Death, which means twin, it means duality. It means that, and in the myth it says Odin, Vili, and Ve, the three aspects of Odin, awareness, willpower, and sacred space, spirit, tore him apart, fought with the original giant, which is the life force essence of the universe, tore him apart and created the sky and created division. And if we look at that, again, you have to know how to read myth. If we look at that, what it's saying is that human beings have this ability of discernment, and it is through our power of discernment that we actually create the universe. And we know this from physics as well. Physics says that, things like light is both a particle and a wave, depending upon the viewpoint and intention of the observer. So that means we are continuously creating our universe with the powers of Odin, Vili, and Ve. So I think that Odin, we go back to the myth, it goes through a list of all the dwarves, because again, dwarves are humanoid in fashion. And if you look at the names of the dwarves, they're all human emotions or psychic aspects of the human personality. And so what that tells me is that our emotions have the ability to become living entities. So I believe that Odin was among the first of these emotional powers in the universe that became self-aware. And through continuous self-awareness, Odin, Woden, means he who is consumed with shamanic ecstasy, shamanic self-awareness. If we look at Odin that way, Odin is the first human. He went beyond the dwarf nature. We all have dwarf nature within us, which is our lower self. And we move past that and we become human. And then when we become Odin, we become completely self-aware. Then we, like Odin, become greater than the gods. And the gods honor that by giving Odin the place of the Allfather. So I believe that is our destiny. I don't know if I answered your question, Saeed, or not, but that is my understanding of all that. All right, so let's keep going. What else? Do I see any other questions here? Would Odin have spent time first as an enlightened master and elf before evolving to godhood? That's a good question. I don't have the answer to that. My feeling is that Odin went straight to his place as a god, as the head of the gods. But I'm willing to be wrong on that. That's just my feeling about that. You know, because I agree with you, there's a difference there. I feel that there's a difference between what the elves are doing and what the celestial gods are doing. So let's talk about that, since you brought that question up. The celestial gods are, you think about what the stars are. We know, again, from science, that among the first things that came into existence were stars. And that everything in the universe is actually made up of celestial material, including us. We're made of stuff of stars, dust, everything. It's all comes from stars, from all the stuff that happens from inside of stars, and then it gets, whatever. So the celestial deities live in a timeless perfection. This is why they are so intense. And in the Thunder Wheel, we can look at it, I'll put the rune wheel up here. Asgard is in the northeast, which would be the first, as you're coming to the right. There, you get to the northeast, and we have Asgard there in the northeast, and this is where the celestial deities are represented in terms of the 8 directions. And this represents the first beginning. The north actually isn't manifested reality. It's unmanifested reality that's getting ready to be manifested. And then it comes into Asgard. And they live in this timeless perfection. So let's take a look at where that is in the northeast and the runes associated with that. Okay, so then we have the elf home, and so we'll look at on the rune, the thunder wheel here. The elf home is going to be in the northwest, so this is a thunder wheel. And that's where in terms of the energies of the directions, that's where the elves dwell, in Lios Alfheim, light elf home. In fact, there's a whole understanding I'm starting to get about the difference between light elves and dark elves and dwarves and all of that. And actually one of my apprentices helped me understand that. It's important as a teacher that I recognize when somebody has an ability that I can learn from, a knowledge that I can learn from. And this is one. This guy has an understanding of dwarves, and I learn from him. He asks me a lot of questions, and then I hear from him some things that I didn't understand. And his asking me questions helps me to understand things better. So we'll get into that. But the light elves are the elves that we're talking about, which are the ascended masters of the human race. These are people who were once human beings just like we are. And they passed through this stage of being human, went beyond that to the point where they didn't need to reincarnate in physical form, at least in our physical reality. And they dwell in the northwest. So it's pretty much the exact opposite. So if the northeast is timeless perfection, the northwest is a direct result of time and experience. Now the gods, because they live in timeless perfection, are a lot like children. meaning that they see things in very black and white terms. That's why they live in Asgard. They don't live in Os home, or the home of the gods. They live in the fortress of the gods. They live in the fortress of the gods because they want to protect their timeless perfection from what they perceive as the imperfection of time. And so that's why the Vanir and the Aesir fight with each other, because the Vanir, if you look again in the Thunder Wheel, they are all the way in the west. So they're almost on the complete other side of the spectrum. And the west, in comparison to the northeast, is completely different in terms of how it looks at reality, because the west is the realm of magic, of fertility, it's the realm of wisdom, and these are things that can only happen within a framework of time. Wisdom comes through experience. Now the gods don't have experience like we understand it. They're pure essence, they're purity, which is why they're so important. In the northeast, in the Vedic tradition, the northeast is where you place the altar. Now they may not understand why that is, but from what I have synthesized and put together, it's because the northeast is where energy first comes into manifestation, and it's in a very pure, intense form. So there's a danger there, because the northeast is also called a demon door, and it's a ghost door, because when we get too fundamentalist in our views, because that's one of the dangers of the Aesir. The Aesir are so pure, they have such little tolerance for anything that they don't perceive to be pure, they can have kind of a fundamentalist attitude. This is again why we've got a lot of people in Asatru and neo-heathenism who tend to be very extreme, either on a racial sense or a political sense or whatever. And the reason for that is they worship the Aesir, so they tend to see the world in that black and white sort of understanding. But the reason why it's a ghost door is because when you become too self-righteous and you become blinded by your self-righteousness, the intense inspiration of the purity of the gods, when you become blinded by that and become puffed up with, your self-righteous, purity, that opens the door for all kinds of negativity. Because again, if you look at the Thunder Wheel, the northeast is where Asgard is, the southwest is where Helholm is, where all of our unconscious, unresolved problems and issues are, the underworld. And so they have a direct connection to each other. And so guess what? The back door of Asgard goes right into Helheim, and vice versa. So just take a look at that for a second. So that is very different from the Northwest, because the Northwest is the realm of the light elves. The light elves have achieved their righteousness, if you want to call it that, as a result of the wisdom they've achieved through their experience. Now here's one thing that Odin and the elves have in common. So again, I'm open to this idea that Alan asked, did Odin become an elf first? I don't know. My feeling is no, but one of the things that the elves and Odin have in common is that they have earned through their own self-sacrifice their awakening, their enlightenment. Odin sacrificed himself on the Tree of Life. He sacrificed himself to himself. He sacrificed his identity, his ego. We're going to talk about that today. He sacrificed his ego in order to gain his true awareness, his true and expanded awareness of himself, which is the teaching within that is that we have to become vulnerable. So this idea of constantly protecting yourself, building up your ego, you become susceptible to all kinds of things. In fact, when I was doing the internal martial arts, the easiest guys to beat up are the big muscly guys. You know, I mean, I've been lifting weights now. You know, I'm back into lifting weights. So, if I wanted to be back in fighting form, I would lose all this muscle because it slows you down. Because the easiest way to take down a big muscly guy is to know, you know, nerve points and all that kind of stuff, and you can take him down like that. Because all that muscle is full of all this nervous energy, and if you know how to slice into that, you can take him out in a second. But if you try and go up against a muscly guy with muscles, so the way to win against this idea of the ego, the really reinforced ego, the way that you have to work through that is through the opposite, which is to be vulnerable. And so we're going to talk about that too. Hopefully we'll have time to talk about how is it that you become everything by becoming nothing. You know, how do you become God by losing all of your power? It's one of these very difficult things to comprehend, but that's where it is. And that's what Odin did. When he sacrificed himself to himself, he became vulnerable. He said nobody came to him with a drinking horn. Nobody offered him food or drink. He died to himself. And that was, you know, we could talk about the tree of life being the spinal column and the kundalini and all that other stuff. But to answer your question, the elves and Odin have this in common, that they have achieved their awakening through experience. So that's one thing that they have in common. Anyway, so that's a longer subject. Again, I don't have a complete answer to that, but let me take a look here and see if there's any other questions that I can answer. Odin could represent the first evolution from dwarf to human, or the first evolution of all the way from dwarf to God. Yeah, so you're pretty much kind of voicing my thoughts about that as well. So, all right, so again, if you're new, if you're just coming into the broadcast here, we're talking about how to become a god on earth, what that means, some of the misunderstandings that we have. Feel free to ask any question you want. When I am in between rants, I'll look and see what the questions are, and I'll answer whatever I can. So, all right, let me see. I want to look at... All right, so, again, I want to talk to you about the difference between God, with a big G, and God as a little g. And I want to submit to you that the idea of God with a big G is a complete departure from the original understanding of what divinity was. This is new. Now, it's been in our world, depending on where you are, for 1 to 2,000 years, so it's very deeply ingrained in our society and in our unconscious. And this is where people first go. So this is why I picked this picture here of, what does it mean to be God on earth, right? And take a look at that again. And to ask yourself, what comes to mind when you see that? So this idea of an all-controlling, omnipotent God who has control over everything and everybody else, that is not how our ancestors viewed divinity. They did not see the gods that way. And this is really shown with our Germanic ancestors, because it's very clear, not only from the myths but from history, that our ancestors didn't bow to anybody, not even the gods. And I can't remember the exact words, but I remember reading something. I believe it was in England, and there was an old Anglo-Saxon warrior who was, getting ready to convert to Christianity. And understand that a lot of our ancestors didn't understand what they were doing. They looked for power. And so they saw that the Christian armies were very powerful, so a lot of them would go, well, I want that God. Not understanding that they'd have to give up not only their gods, but the understanding behind that. So one of these chieftains was talking with the priest, and the priest was talking about bowing to God and to Jesus, and he said, I don't bow to anybody. And he said, my ancestors, my fathers, my grandfathers don't bow to anybody. We don't do that. And the guy says, well, you're going to have to do that if you want to go to heaven. Otherwise, you'll go to hell. And he said, well, where are my ancestors? Where's my grandfather and my father? And he says, oh, they're in hell. He said, well, then I'm not bowing to your God. I'm going to go where they are. That kind of understanding that this idea of having to bow and give yourself away to another God was totally foreign to them. So when we talk about becoming God on earth, it doesn't mean that we're going to have control over other people. It means that we're going to have control over ourselves, our own destiny, our own environment. So the question comes up, people ask me this, because I share with people, how I live. One of the things that I value most is my freedom. I'm 53 years old. I don't have kids. I'm not married. I don't have pets. I've chosen to live in Southern California because I want to surf. That's you can see I got 2 surfboards here, right? That's my main thing. This other stuff that I do for a living, I asked myself years ago, I said, I don't want to work for anybody else. I want to work for myself. And I said, you know what, I don't even want to work. And I thought, okay, so how can I make a living doing what I would do anyway? I'm doing it. Everything that I'm talking about, everything that I'm doing, I would do anyway. And so my belief is, do what you would do anyway. To do anything less for me is not to value my own soul. I have a responsibility to my soul to live in that way. And so, I got kind of off track there, but again, I want to say, in order to understand this idea of what it means to be a God on earth, you have to change your fundamental assumption. So that's why I showed you that picture, because in that picture, the assumption is to be God means to control everything and everybody else, and bow down to me. And that is not how our ancestors understood divinity. Our ancestors understood that the gods were our family, that we are connected to them, and from a wizard perspective, the gods are us. They're inside of you. Whenever you look up into the stars at night, you're not looking outside of you, you're looking deep into your own self. So you already are God. You already are the source of everything. And then we run into the mystery of, well, how is it there's a bunch of omnipotent gods running around? How, we all have this holographic ability, and our own universes that we create sort of merge into each other. And that's part of the lesson, is to learn how to keep our identity intact while at the same time interacting with a bunch of other immortal omnipotent deities running around. And so I want to get into talking about a healthy ego before I go any further, but I want to check and see if there's any questions here. All right, so let's see. Common thread in NDE research is that one's ability to love genuinely and deeply plays a key role in being able to expand one's consciousness in the light. Spiritual growth is development. When one can expand in the light to become a son, S-U-N, of love, then one becomes a co-creator. You develop this through the application of the same technique that the original creator used to evolve into God of consciousness. So, and then you put, don't do this, higherlightchurch.com. Hey, don't do that. I appreciate that, but don't put somebody else's website on my website. Come on. That's just, that's, by the way, people that do that, when they go and they put a comment and they put a link, YouTube automatically throws it into the spam. So, anyway, there's a reason for that. I have a couple of things that I agree with John Chevalier, and a couple of things I don't agree with. First, there's an assumption in there creator used to evolve into God. The original creator, that smacks of monotheism to me. It smacks of the Abrahamic tradition, Jehovah. You may not be in that fundamentalist viewpoint, but I talk a lot about how that seeps into the New Age understanding. In my experience, that actually has a corrosive effect on a healthy identity. So I don't agree with you that we are trying to be like the original creator God. I don't see that the universe is made up that way. I think that is something that was imposed on our understanding over the last 2,000 years. I also kind of want to respond to what I'm seeing, that this is about love. I agree with you. The ability to love genuinely is absolutely fundamental. But there's another aspect to that which doesn't come through, which somebody can misinterpret that, which means somebody can look at that and say they have to give themselves away and martyr themselves to love other people, sacrifice themselves, the whole Jesus idea of sacrificing yourself for other people. And to me, that is very codependent and very destructive. So I would have to merge that with the understanding that not only do we need to have the ability to love genuinely, but in order to love genuinely, we first have to be devoted to our soul, our spirit. And as if for those who are familiar with the work that I do here, I talk a lot about our soul desire, and that our first and foremost responsibility, the only commandment that there is that we must fulfill our deepest soul desire. And when we fulfill our deepest soul desire, we automatically help and empower others. So you can't love somebody else, like they say, you can't love somebody else until you love yourself. But it's more than that. You can't love other people until you know how to fulfill yourself and until you are self-aware and self-sufficient. This is this idea of becoming a God. A God is sufficient within him or herself. So while we can have deep connections with other people, we can have deep connections, love connections, we can merge our souls with our soulmate, our life can't depend on them. Our life has to be self-created, self-dependent within ourselves. And so I would say that the gods, and especially Odin, is self-created. And the message of Odin is to become self-created, self-aware, self-empowered. The idea of something creating us, I believe, I don't think that's how our ancestors viewed it. If you go back more than 2,000 years, I don't think they saw it that way. And I personally, on an experiential level, I don't think it's a healthy viewpoint. Again, I'm not trying to pick fights with people, but yeah. Anyway, Alan says, we seek to become aware of, unveil our divine spark and blow it into a flame, our spiritual fire. I agree, that sounds good. So again, I'm going to give you if you really want to understand my perspective, again, we're talking about assumptions. So, I picked on John, and my apologies if it looked like I was picking on you, but it's important that we understand what our assumptions are. Because we can't have a dialogue. For instance, if a born-again Christian was to come and try and have a dialogue with me, I'm going to stop them almost immediately and say, hang on a second. You're quoting all this scripture to me, but you have to know that I don't see the Bible or the New Testament as having any validity. I don't see it as a source material. So if you want to talk about your understanding of God, you're going to have to come from a different assumption. And they have no place to go. Because they're going to want to get into these intellectual, pissing matches based on their assumption. And that's what a lot of people get into trouble with. You try and argue with a fundamentalist about, the role of God, or did Jesus exist, or does sin exist, or does hell exist. You can't have a discussion with somebody if they don't share a same fundamental assumption. So it's important to understand the fundamental assumption that I am teaching here is that first and foremost, you are self-created. And that your goal is to continue to self-create. And that you create your own universe. And that we have a bunch of intersecting universes, which are other people and their universes. And that goes back again to what I was first talking about. If if you're just joining us, you can go back and watch from the beginning, and I talk about some examples of the few societies that are left on this planet that I believe operate from our original understanding of how the universe is and our relationship is. And this idea that we live in this multiverse where we live in this three-dimensional reality, but among that is a bunch of other realities that are layered on top of each other. There's the dream world, there's this world, and there's even realities, worlds that different societies have. And I believe, as I said earlier, that the conquest of North America by the Europeans was also a spiritual conquest. And as the Native Americans themselves pointed out, the majority of them died from disease before a white man ever stepped onto the continent. And when they were dying from the disease, they didn't know where it was coming from. They saw it as a spiritual attack. And if you look at it from a certain perspective, that is one way to look at it. That's also, I believe, what happened to our ancestors in Europe. That you had this reality that was being created by the Abrahamic religion, by the Roman Empire, by the Catholic Church. And before they would go in to conquer different parts of Europe, the first people that came in were the missionaries, who would bring this idea of the one God and sacrificing yourself and dying for sin and that you're evil and that God hates you and all of that, and doing all of that, work on people's assumptions about their relationship to the universe. Because if our ancestors knew that this was a spiritual attack upon their world, they would never have let it happen. I'll give you another example. Again, I don't remember the exact source of it, but it was in Scandinavia. Scandinavia was the last major Germanic part of the European continent, and Iceland was the last, that converted to Christianity, and it took a lot longer. And because they're, geographically more isolated, still to this day you have a lot more connection, even in the culture, to our ancestral understanding than we do on mainland Europe. But there was a chieftain, an earl, I believe, and understand that at that time, in order to be able to have authority and to make money, you were going to have to be working with the Christian king or with the church. And so eventually the rich people had to convert to Christianity in order just to survive financially. Again, it's a spiritual attack on them. When this was going on, there's recorded interaction that the priest came onto the earl's land, and the priest knew what to do. He went around with the holy water, and he went around to the trees, and he went around to the standing stones and was, splashing holy water on the trees and the standing stones and muttering whatever they did. And so the Earl just kind of watched it happen, and in his mind he's like, well, I'm going to be part of the elite and I'll be able to do business and make money and keep my power. And then that night he dreamt that his father and his grandparents came to him and said, what are you doing? Why are you casting us out of our own land? It's a spiritual attack. Now, had that landowner made the decision within himself that he was not good, that if he understood that, he would not have allowed those people onto his land. And then I go back to those Andaman Island people that I said, who are fiercely defending their land. I mean, obviously, somebody could very easily overrun them. And listen to what I'm about to say. All they have is bows and arrows. They don't have any means to defend themselves against rockets, against guns, against, even guys with swords and shields. They don't have the ability to defend themselves against that. So the question is, why is it they are still, to this day, that nobody has set foot on their land except for those first two people I told you about? It's because they have made the decision within themselves that their reality, their spiritual reality that they've created, that they've manifested, their world, which is that island, that they have made the commitment that they are not going to let anything in. That's why when in the 70s, when people tried to make contact with them and gave them gifts on the beach, they didn't take the gifts and run back inside. They slaughtered the pig, buried it, and buried all of the, the cooking pots and all of that, which they could use. They don't have those things. They're smart enough to know that they could use those things that would benefit them, but they're even smarter because they know that this is a bribe, and that if we give ourselves away to this bribe, we are going to lose ourselves. The last remaining part of, or at least one of the few last remaining parts of the original world that we all lived in. So do you see where I'm going with this? We are that. We create our environment. And one of the ways that we lose that is when we give up our identity to someone or something else. And this is the assumption of the Christian religion. Die to yourself, not for yourself, but die to other people. Give your ego up to God. I mean, that just, the destruction of the self is bad. The self is bad. So, if we have time, I want to talk a little bit about what it is to have a correct ego, and I'll talk about the Isa rune and the Thurisaz rune, but let me see if there's any other questions here. All right, I don't see anything here. We've still got 13 people watching. You must be rapt, attentively listening to me. All right, so let's just get right into it. So let's take a look here at the Isa rune. The Isa rune is the rune of the self. There is no coincidence that the I sound means me. Ek, ik, ego, ego. These are all different Indo-European words for I. And so this is the rune for that. So notice that this rune cannot be reversed. Okay? So just hang on to that. The Isa rune cannot be reversed. Now, again, if we look at the rune wheel, we see where Isa is placed. And I want you to look at the other runes that are in that same area of the east. On the right side of your screen, the eastern realm, the realm of the giants, is the realm of the ego, the realm of the self. And so take a look at the other runes that are on the rune wheel connected to the eastern direction. We have Thurisaz, we have Isa, and we have Ehwaj. Thurisaz is the rune of the physical, because the first 8 is about the physical realm. The second 8 is where Isa is, and Isa is in the psychological, emotional realm. And then we have Ehwaj, which is the spiritual realm. And here's now when we look at all 3 of these runes, I'll talk you through them, and you'll see the duality, the dichotomy within them, and the connection. So the first is Thurisaz, this rune here. Thurisaz, unlike Isa, can be reversed. And so Thurisaz is the rune of personal boundaries. It's a rune of protection, but specifically it gives personal boundaries. And so we can have a weak personal boundary. We can have problems with our boundaries. And when that happens, and it comes up in readings, Thurisaz is reversed. But once we create healthy boundaries for ourselves, both physical, because again, the aura is a boundary, and we know the aura is the first and the last protection we have against not only spiritual negativity, psychological, but bacterial. A lot of people get sick. It's because their aura is not very strong. This is why people who do a lot of drugs or alcohol, they get sick a lot, because one of the reasons, besides filling themselves with poison, the other reason is that the aura is our protective shield, has a direct result connection to our state of mind. and all kinds of other things. So if our mind is muddy, guess what? Our aura gets muddy, it gets weak. And also drugs and alcohol will take energy from your aura, give you an experience of life force energy in your head, but it does that by taking energy out of your aura, so you don't have any protection, and that's why one of the reasons people get sick. So if you have a strong boundary, then you have the freedom to create a healthy identity. So this is interesting. Isa can't be reversed, which means that you either have a healthy identity or you don't. So when we talk about becoming a god on earth, now I'll bring in some other discussions that I've had. And again, my understanding about how I need to formulate the understanding of being a god on earth comes from me interacting with people and realizing they're operating from a different assumption than I am. So I need to be clear about that. So that's why I gave you that picture of this big giant, God touching the earth with his finger, controlling everything. Because then we get into this idea of, psychosis, where people have a misunderstanding about who they are. So I talked about this in the video that I just uploaded called Kundalini Psychosis versus Kundalini Awakening. And so people who have Kundalini Psychosis are people who think they're being awakened. And they have all kinds of visions, and they see themselves as God incarnate, or something like that, or they see themselves as an avatar of, whatever it is. Or they have very violent physical reactions, feelings of itching and burning, and their head exploding, and then they have also experiences of being attacked by demons or by evil entities or aliens or whatever. So you have this dichotomy of, on the one hand, they think that they're God, and at the other hand, they see themselves as these paranoid victims. And you see this with people who are, narcissists, people who suffer from narcissistic delusions. On the one hand, they'll tell you that they're God, and then in the next moment, like Charles Manson, they'll talk about being Jesus, and then the next moment, why everybody wants to kill him because he's God. That kind of, you're the most important piece of garbage in the room kind of idea. Everybody's got it in for you, and we've got these average people living in, double wide trailers in the middle of wherever, who think that aliens and demons want to attack them, and they're so important that all of the evil entities in the universe want to attack them and possess them and destroy them. See what I mean? It goes hand in hand. You can't be a victim without having an overinflated ego, and you can't have an overinflated ego without seeing yourself as a victim. So neither of those are Isa, because Isa is one thing. Isa is the true centered identity. And so one of the topics I wanted to talk about was how to have omnipotence and at the same time being completely surrendered. So again, I'll give you an example. One of the things that I talk to people about is their responsibility to others. And this is rampant in our society. And one of the reasons in my experience that people become sick with diseases is because they have boundary issues, and a lot of people take responsibility for other people's problems. I deal with this all day when I do counseling and I do psychic readings, and people will call me and say, yeah, my boyfriend is on drugs and I need to take him in and get him better, and I have to say, you can't do anything for him. You have no control over him. Yeah, but if I can just talk some sense into him. No, you can't do that. You are not powerful enough to do that. That is not your responsibility. That's between him and the universe. And if he really wants help, he can find it. It's not your job to fix him. It's not your job to cure him. You're not that powerful. So that sounds, incongruous with what I'm saying, that you can be an omnipotent deity on this planet. But one of the first things you do is, I don't mess with other people's omnipotence. They have the right to create their own world. It's not my job to figure that out for them. That's their job. They have to live out that video game that they've created. That's their job. My job is to take responsibility for my world. So again, going back to those Andaman people who live on that tiny island that nobody in 50,000 years has ever been on that island, because they have taken that responsibility. And we see that every time somebody comes up. They're not afraid. You know, helicopters, they're firing arrows at the helicopters. They have to know that if that helicopter lands, they have to know that those people have things that can destroy them. But they have made that commitment to themselves and to their identity that they're not going to let anybody come in and change their world that they've created. So we have to have that same understanding. I'm not saying we have to be paranoid and shoot arrows at people, don't get me wrong. It's that the same understanding is that, you know, I mean, whatever's going on in the news, you know, people get so flipped out about what's going on in the news. One guy, I think I shared about this, but it's just so funny to me. I saw a guy who was with a group of people, and he was talking he was talking about social media, and he was talking about all the things that are going on in the government and what the damn liberals are doing because of this and that. And I wanted to say, you're getting all of your information on social media. Doesn't that tell you something right there? But I mean, what does that do at this moment? None of that is affecting me at this moment. At this moment, I have everything that I need. I am taken care of. I have all of my needs met. All that stuff is going on. Yeah, I'm not unaware of it, but I'm not going to let it come in and destroy my world. I'm not going to give them that kind of power. And so you can't have that comfort until you know that you yourself have the power within yourself, regardless of where you are. You have the power to create a safe world, a safe environment for yourself. And when you do that, when you have true thurisaj, when your boundaries are intact, it doesn't matter how powerful something or somebody is, they won't find you. They won't get into your world. That only happens when you allow them to. So that's why I keep harping on in my teachings that one of the first things we have to do is get rid of victim mentality. And how difficult and frightening that is to give that up. There's a lot of security in being a victim. We could talk about that, but anyway. So once again, I've ranted on and on. I forgot what the point of it was. Let's see if there's any other. We can advise, not impose. Imposition robs people of self-will. So I agree with you, Alan. So I'm going to take that even a step further. Unsolicited advice is abuse. So you are on my channel. You guys know ahead of time that I'm going to be ranting and raving about my opinions. You have the right to get on or get off, watch or not watch. But if I'm walking down the street, or if you're in my life, unless you've asked me for my opinion, I'm not going to give it to you. Even if I know I'm like the guy, like I said, the guy going off about social media and all that. I really wanted to sit him down and talk him through about, you know, where are you getting your information? You know, have you really thought this through? There's so much other information out there. You're only focusing on, you know, blah, blah, blah. But he didn't ask for my opinion, so I'm not going to give it to him. That's abuse. So Alan, I want you to meditate on that. When you advise people, are you doing it because they've asked for it? Or are you taking upon yourself the responsibility when to advise people? You know, I only advise people when they pay me. That's another reason why you have to pay me if you want to work with me. Because when you pay me, you are paying me money, you're asking for my help. Now you've given me permission to give you my advice. But even so, those of you who know that I work with, lots of times I'll say things like, I have an idea about that. Would you like to hear it? Because I need you to give me your consent. I need you to give me, or sometimes I'll say, you know, I'm about to tell you something you're not going to want to hear. Do you want to hear it? Because you have to ask for my advice. Otherwise, I'm abusing you. So it is not my responsibility to change anybody or correct anybody. It is not my responsibility. In fact, it is harmful not only to them, but to me. It is harmful to me to go and impose my will on somebody else. This is what conquerors don't understand. And one of the great blessings that that little Andaman island continues to give to the whole world, because we wouldn't even think about it, because it's such an anomaly. In fact, how did that possibly happen? How could that little tiny island, filled with people who still live in Paleolithic times, how is it that they have managed to keep all of the giant armies throughout history from invading them? There must be such immense strength that they have. Not only that, but the Indian government protects them. It's against the law because it's within the boundaries of the country of India. The Indian government will not allow you. The Indian military will stop you before you even come anywhere near that island. You can't do it. How did they do that? One of the most powerful nuclear countries in the world. India is very powerful, by the way. They're one of the most powerful militaries on the planet. And they have the Indian government protecting them. Of course, they probably don't know that. But that just tells you the power that they must have. This is spiritual power. Spiritual power. This is what I'm talking about. And so again, we're talking about Isa and Thurisaj. And again, the people who have Kundalini psychosis, not awakening, but Kundalini psychosis, people who think that they're God, who think that they have the ability to control others and control the universe and create and destroy worlds, and yet, of course, their lives are completely chaotic and miserable. Right? But they're the most important victims in the world. This is psychosis. This is not identity, true identity. So Odin is also about true identity. So going back to John Chevalier's understanding where, people, one's ability to truly love is also interconnected with one's ability to be your own self, to be self-sufficient emotionally, to be able to empathize with others, to be able to cry at the sadness and the challenges that everybody goes through, and still not let that destroy you. To have relationships with people. People die of disease, how do we do that? How can we still be self-sufficient and watch loved ones die, or watch loved ones, kill themselves with drugs and alcohol and whatever else? This is, again, how do we do that, have empathy without letting it destroy us? Because we have to. If we're to be gods on earth, that's one of the things we have to do. And so now the last thing I want to talk about is the idea that to have true power means to be vulnerable to the flow. So one of the things that one of my teachers said is that strength is no strength. And that you become everything by becoming nothing. And if you don't understand that, it sounds like martyring yourself. But he was talking specifically, the great thing about internal martial arts is you have to be able to show that you've made progress by being able to physically show that you've learned the technique. So how to strike somebody without using any physical strength, or how to, this is one of the first things that blew my mind, is when I first went to the spirit fighting class, and there was this little tiny Japanese guy. It was a Chinese art, but he was Japanese. And I came in like I am now. I was lifting a lot of weights, and I came in, and he, got one of the other students, and he said, "Okay, I want you to grab onto my arm." So I did. I grabbed onto his arm. He said, "I'm going to strike him, and I want you to tell me what muscles I was using to do that." So he barely touches the guy, and you hear this loud crack, and the guy falls to the ground. He didn't hurt him. He knew what he was doing. Don't get me wrong. It was an energy strike. And he said, "Okay, what muscles did I use?" I said, "I didn't feel anything. I didn't feel anything flex." He said, "That's right. I didn't use any physical strength at all." And he was trying to show me that all of this muscle here was completely useless against him. And it was. When he struck me, I wrote about it in one of my books. I think it was Awakening Sleipnir. I wrote it in Awakening Sleipnir. When he struck me with that, I knew that there was nothing I could do to defend myself against the power that this guy had. And his power came from what he said, becoming nothing. And so being able to control your universe, you have to do what Odin did. You have to become nothing. I know we're getting close to, oh, I guess there's plenty of light here. So again, this is one of those dichotomies. And it should, if it feels like your brain is coming apart, it should feel that way. If I say these things and you think you understand off, by first hearing them without having the experience, you're probably not understanding it, although maybe you are. I certainly didn't, first time I heard of this stuff. But it should feel like it's pulling you apart. And so now the last thing I want to talk to you about before we end, again, I don't see any other people still on. We've got 12 people watching. The last thing I want to say before we end is, I forgot what the last thing was I wanted to say. Balance versus chaos. Let's talk about that. So, one of the things that is very hard to comprehend in the beginning is this idea that in order to have complete control of your environment, you have to give up control. And this is especially true when it comes to intending your reality. Intending your reality is not the same as forcing it through an act of will. And there's a lot of magic out there, that has to do with people trying to load their intention onto something and forcing their will to create the universe. That's like trying to, ride a race in a slalom course while driving an 18-wheeler. It'd be a lot easier if you got in a Ferrari, and with a lot less effort. So there are ways to do that without using any effort. So one of the things that I've learned is that when it comes to intending my reality, there's no effort involved. There's a surrender to my soul desire. And sometimes we don't know what our soul desire is, and we have to get out of our way. So our intellect, which intellect means that which picks apart. Our intellect is constantly picking things apart, which is great because, as I said earlier, without that we can't differentiate, and that's how we create our universe. That's how we do it. Our intellect helps us create our universe. But in terms of creating out of nothing, that is an act of surrender. And it really is just surrendering to the internal reality that is within your soul that wants to come out. And again, this is the lesson, because then the question is, well, why doesn't everybody do that? Right? Why doesn't everybody just create what they want? That's why we're here. We're here to learn how to intend. We're here to learn how to create effortlessly and what that really means. And so we have to bump into that. And that is the struggle, the challenge of life. That's why we incarnate thousands and thousands of times, because this lesson is so amazing and important, because we're all destined to become gods, all of us. We're all destined. I don't care. Pick the worst person in history. That person is destined to become a god. They will come back. And this is why we have to live through all kinds of challenging karma, which just is the result of our actions. I could even say that karma is just the result of our misunderstandings. And that challenging karma is about understanding, oh, that's how you do it. It's something we give to ourselves. It's a gift we give to ourselves. We only see it as difficult when we're in this avatar that we've downloaded into. But once we've downloaded out of it, we don't see those challenges in the same way at all. But we have to take them seriously, otherwise we don't learn. You touch a hot stove, you burn your hand, you learn not to touch the hot stove again. So we have to have that. So, all right, let's see here. I don't see any more questions. So I'm going to do a little bit of business. I've talked plenty. So, for those of you who are part of the Advanced Shamanism course, which can be found at thunderwizard.com, I now have finally worked out my scheduling issues. And so for those of you who are at the third level and above who work with me on a one-on-one basis, you should by now have received the link that you can take to the page where you can schedule your sessions with me. And so have my number. I will also have given you my direct line so that when it's time for your appointment, you've already gotten that time selected and you call me at that specific time. That saves me a lot of trouble from having to schedule and coordinate and having all those problems. Now you guys can schedule it yourselves, and I just show up on my hours of work and the phone rings, it rings. We ran out of spaces for that level, the level where people can work with me 1 hour per month. I went ahead and added a couple more because there was one on there. There's somebody that is still kind of taking up space and will be coming back soon. So I wanted to open up at least so there's at least 10 spaces in there. But eventually, if things continue the way they are, that we're going to run out of space. So there's 2 spaces now if you want to become an apprentice and work with me 1 hour a month. Get on it now before the spaces are all gone. There are other spaces available for 2 times per month and 4 times per month and above that. Those are available. Let's see what else. All of my books, michaelwilliamdenny.com. Just go there and that will take you to my Amazon page where all of my books should be there, including this one, which will help you understand how to learn the basic assumption underneath what it takes to become a god on earth. Probably can't read it because it's a little blurry, but it says the Shamanic secret commandment to a perfect life, and then it says the missing ingredient to the secret. That will give you, if you just learn that book and practice what's in that book, you'll naturally get to that place. Let's see what else. If you want to learn about runes, we're doing a lot of rune work in the Master Shamanism course. Here are the 3 books that you can get on Amazon about runes. There's 3 of them: Rune Shamanism, Rune Divination, and Advanced Rune Shamanism. If you remember, I talked earlier about all these crazy powers and things that my teachers had, and I eventually experienced working in an esoteric Taoist mystical cult, I just called it a cult, mystical sect. I did put that into some forms which people can use safely, and it's turned out to be far more powerful than even I expected, and that is called Celestial Qigong. Here's what the cover of that looks like. If you want to see all my videos, go to Amazon and just type in Michael William Denny on Amazon, and all of my videos should come up. So that is it for now. I think I got through all my business. Let's see, are there any other? Nope, let's see. You used to have only 5 spots, now you have 10. Yeah, there should be at least 10 spots in that that 3rd level. Yeah. Okay, so that's it. I think we're done for now. I've talked myself out. If you have any questions, you know where to reach me. Until then, my friends, remember that you do have the power to create and control your life. And it is possible to be completely self-sufficient while still being able to interact and share and merge your lives with other people. And it is possible to become a god on earth. And learning what that is a mystery we will continue to delve into So until next time, my friends, may the power of the gods and the ancestors be with you.